everybody, I'm Keisha Hatchett with TV Guide.
I'm Kelly Connolly with TV Guide.
And I'm Jeff Bakalar with CNET.
And spoiler alert, we're about to talk about the first 2 episodes of Jordan Peele's The Twilight Zone. I don't have that sort of history that you guys do, so I really want to hear about your first impressions of this.
I loved it. I'm already all in. I am really into the vibe of the show so far. It feels like The Twilight Zone, sort of inarguably.
For me, that was like the barometer. Like, are they going to rely too much on modern sensibilities and kind of, drift a little too far into, the sort of like current climate of what reality is like? Or is this going to just tell stories that have lessons that are weird, and thankfully it's sort of like the latter.
So let's get into the first episode, The Comedian, starring Kumail Nanjiani. And it's basically this stand-up comedian who wants to be famous, and as part of his act, he must talk about the things that are personal in his life, but they disappear when he does so. So it's a question of how far will you go for the price of fame? What did you think of that episode?
I thought it told a really interesting story. Twilight Zone classically has these mysterious figures, and I think they nailed it with the Tracy Morgan cameo. Twilight Zone for me has always been about being uncomfortable too, and there's a lot of like interesting camera angle choices. So I think it told a really interesting story and kind of ticked all the boxes.
Well, I mean, that theme of, what will you do to be successful, right, I think is very quintessentially Twilight Zone. And I mean, were there any episodes that it reminded you of? Because for me, I thought of one that I watched fairly recently was a game of pool.
You beat me, and you live. You lose, and you die.
Where Jack Klugman is a pool player who just wants to be famous. Wants to be the best pool player. Yeah. But there's a cost that he doesn't see coming. It felt right to bring that theme back.
Sure.
And to look at this man who is doing something that he quickly realizes is inexcusable, and he's doing it to get famous. He was trying to justify it to himself by targeting people who he thought deserved it.
A lot of these episodes end where like the worst possible ending happens, where he basically talks himself out of existence. He mentions himself and he's gone, and he sort of has this like suicide almost.
I've been Samir Wasson!
So let's get into the second episode, which is A Nightmare at 30,000 Feet, starring Adam Scott. And this is a remake of an original Twilight Zone episode.
I'm curious to hear what you thought, because you had never seen that and you watched it.
Okay, my experience with the Twilight Zone is I heard of it, never watched it, not a fan of horror or anything scary like that. So going into this episode, I felt that universal feeling of helplessness, knowing that down to your core something was inherently wrong, but everyone is just telling you you're crazy, you're irrational, this is not true.
The Russian mafia wants to kill Igor Orlov, okay?
I mean, imagine flying in the 60s.
Well, that's what I was thinking about too. Like, it was new for a lot of people. I feel like there are certain elements of that play into it during that time where air travel was probably a nerve-wracking experience to begin with.
Flying now is not as scary to us, presumably, as it would have been in the early 1960s, sure. But now there's that idea when people are flying that they're all sort of looking sideways at each other. So they played on that instead.
And then it's just fitting that the one person that he least suspected as the terrorist turned out to be the one to bring the plane down, and it was, I'm sorry, a white man.
Yep.
Speaking to, again, a very relevant issue today. So it's just, again, so brilliantly incorporating these relevant issues into the show. That's what I really appreciate about it. And shout out to Jordan Peele for stepping into this new role as the host and filling some very big shoes. He just exemplifies that foreboding energy so perfectly and sets the tone for every episode. It's just such a delight.
Whenever I see him, I'm always like, oh, he's also very funny, and I appreciate that. But he's doing this weird sort of like head nod that he's done, which I'm just like, all right.
Right now?
No, he's just like, almost like his Obama impression that he does. Like, it's really kind of classic.
So we've talked about the episodes. Did this show live up to the hype?
It's a good question. So like for me personally, I was waiting to be disappointed, quite honestly. I said to myself, like, you're either gonna be all in or you're gonna pass. And for me, that was met with with the desire to keep going. Like I said, when we talked about the first episode, the packaging, the presentation, the willingness to just not let anything kind of interfere with that storytelling, and the timelessness of what they're doing, for me, feels like they are honoring it in a way that I want to continue watching. So yes, it met the Jeff hype.
It met my hype in a way that I think I wasn't expecting it. I didn't expect to be so moved just by seeing something that felt so much like the Twilight Zone. Some of them are going to be just average episodes of the Twilight Zone, and I think that we forget that there were more episodes of the original series than not that were just, you know, an episode. Yeah. They weren't all Monsters Are Due on Maple Street or Nightmare at 20,000 Feet or, you know, Time Out at Last. Like, it's going to be the Twilight Zone in ordinary ways and extraordinary ways.
For me, the Twilight Zone always felt somewhat inaccessible. It just felt like it existed in this different world that wasn't necessarily my world. I just really appreciated how grounded in reality this series is, and the fact that Jordan Peele is enlisting all of my favorite people to be on this show. And I can enjoy them and appreciate them in a way that I couldn't be able to in other mediums. So we all agree, this show definitely lives up to the hype. Check out new episodes Thursdays on CBS All Access.